Baruch Hashem, we're at the Zarua Beit Midrash, ready to study Talmud together. I'm holding in a sugya in Moed Katan. Okay, this is one of the tractates that indeed is part of the Babylonian Talmud and deals with the laws of mourning. And what we started last week was with a Mishnah that is going to be our Mishnah. Because when we study Talmud, we always say, we have to know, what's our Mishnah? Because there's Gemara that flows after a Mishnah, and the discussions can either be about that Mishnah, or they could be discursively connected to that Mishnah, or discursively connected to a word someone mentions, or discursively connected to some area of the world someone mentions, or a rabbi's name someone mentions, or it reminds them of something, just like regular good old conversation around the table. Oh, I once saw a film, The Conversation. Did you ever see The Conversation with Gene Hackman? Alav Shalom. He's now. Well, they used all these beeps for the soundtrack, and what a picture. Oh, speaking of conversations, let me tell you about a conversation I had with so-and-so. And the way that Talmud works sometimes is just like that. Someone picks up that one word. This conversation you had with so-and-so about how you inherited this much from your Aunt Dorothy, but she left that much to my cousin, and how could she do that? This is the kind of conversation that you might see on the page of Talmud. Let's get back to our Mishnah here about, it is about inheritances, except it's about inheritances of land. It's not about inheritances of money, but that happened to come in. So this is the way the conversations in Gemara can sometimes happen. And sometimes in order to really collect wisdom about one issue or topic that you really want to focus on, which is what I want to do, having this Mishnah, our Mishnah, deal with the topic of 3 days before a Yontif. You had a death in the family, you buried a beloved, you're sitting Shiva for 3 days, and then what happens to Shiva? It's cut. At least we said people generally think like in general terms, it's cut, Shiva's done. That's not exactly what we said last week. We explained it more deeply according to the way the Gemara really understands that. What is that stoppage? It's the real lifting of very specific rules, very specific laws, very specific restrictions on a mourner, but doesn't necessarily undermine any kind of significant status that you ultimately take on, that you ultimately are granted, given by the tradition. That is, you're an Avel, you're an Avela, a Velet, depending on which ancient text you're going to read. You could find differences in the Hebrew. And you're in Avelut. You're in mourning still. Do we still have a period of 7? Do we still have a period of 30? Do we still have a period of a year, as with a parent? These are periods of time. Many people have a certain understanding of those periods as of this generation of Jewish people. But in fact, we have to put ourselves sometimes with texts in the notion of, first of all, the rabbis of the Talmud are defining these things and solidifying at least. Some of them are probably more inherited from years and years and years than others. But we're trying to understand the solidification process oftentimes. And so the committee here and the sages of multi-generations reporting in different names of sages from the Tanaitic age, that is the Mishnaic age, the Amoraic age, that is the Babylonian Talmudic scholars, the Amoraim of Eretz Yisrael, those in Israel. So these are people we want to pay attention to and potentially understand in their different approaches to the either customs or laws that are involved. We're dealing with some what most likely are pretty ancient customs of the Jewish people, because Shiva and Shloshim are periods of mourning that are mentioned, and we'll see where from they derive at least the Shiva one, because I wanted to really focus in on that. The Shloshim period mentioned by Aharon in the Torah, 30 days of mourning. If I'm right, Miriam too, just to put it out there. But the idea that we get to Shiva and that within the Shiva experience, one could have a lifting of the restrictions, that there's a certain nullification that happens. We were interested in this as the subject of the sugya. And I'm interested, as I said, sometimes these studies are for the sake of just studying Mishnah and Gemara, and sometimes these are towards what I'm thinking about within the community. And I had kind of spilled the beans that, for me, a lot of what I've experienced over the now nearly, double cycles of 7 that I'll be here next Yontivs already, that I feel that the Masorah has not dealt enough with the question, what happens when we use this language with people that your Shiva is canceled or your Shiva is nullified from Yontiv, and we don't really understand what some of the Talmudic wisdom is about that situation and how to really understand that lashon, that language of nullification and cancellation, because it feels really like it undermines a certain sense that the tradition should work for me. I mean, I know, and we're going to look at on page 14 as the first thing we're going to go back to now to fill in some of the spaces that we created last week when we first started this study. We know that there is a certain tension between communal simcha and individual avelut, individual mourning. And so it's there that the rabbis actually take off and say that's why you have to nullify in the first place. But then I feel like kind of cheated out of what I think the framework of our mourning practices should be. There are at least some who do really feel cheated. We said there's space for those who want to make a drush for their lives, who want to make meaning of their own experience with our tradition, that it could be very rich and enriching to know that you had only this much of the acute Shiva experience and you went right into a Yontiv. Wouldn't my Zaidi want me to go right into Chag, how he loved the Pesach Seder, let's say? So wouldn't my spouse, wouldn't my God forbid we should have such deaths, children, sisters, brothers, wouldn't they want me to get right back to life? So we're not discounting the fact that it's birshut, it's for the individuals to actually make meaning in their lives based on some of this reality. But we're also saying we want to understand deeply kind of where some of this thinking is about these periods of time, what happens during these periods of time, and what options there are for us in terms of even getting to the level of, again, not all times that we study we do this, but for me, thinking about what's the letter I want to write to folks about what happens when, or what's the page in the book that the Zarua Chevra Kadisha manual says, that says, what happens when I'm faced with the shortening of official ritualistic Shiva and a Yontiv comes? How shall the community respond? What is it for me that happens that could be a way that I process that moment in time? Okay, so that's kind of the framing of why I'm looking at what I'm looking at. We're going to start on 14b. So if you're navigating through anything over there, Ari, or Marion, or Lee, I'm on 14b of Moed Katan, and I'm about, let's say, I'm not looking at the Vilna, so I'm also looking at the Steinsaltz, but I'm in the word aval. Aval eno no heg. So I'm going to scroll. I mean, is this getting us back to more original kind of books that we had in the Jewish world? I'm scrolling to 14. Where are we? That's 16. So here we go back. 15b, 15a. And here we go. Okay. So I want to look at this beginning of a new section and this discussion that was all about a mourner and with festivals and what's happening back on 14. Because remember, we were holding with our Mishnah that was on page 19a already. So I flip back. Just this little piece. Avil eino noheg aveluto baregel. A mourner does not practice the halachot of his mourning on the regel. Regel, why do they use the term regel for the holiday? Because you make a pilgrimage by foot to the temple. So a regel, the shalosh regalim, are because we had this hajj. We have this pilgrimage to the Beit HaMikdash. You don't practice the halachot on the Chag. Now, mind you, if a person was in his home after a burial, already the rabbis know that the regel doesn't have to be a pilgrimage. The regel is now the name of officially holidays, and you were not outside your house for those 3 days. As we learned in this Masechta, if we had read the whole thing together, you're not really leaving. Even when you lose someone, like let's say you are in Shiva, and the situation comes that, God forbid, you lose somebody else, and there's another Shiva, and it's day 2, you're not going to that other Shiva yet. So 3 days, as we've been defining it because we're interested, because our Mishnah talks about the 3 days of sitting Shiva before a festival. In the 3 days, we know that there's something pretty restrictive about that. But the festival itself, we're interested in here on 14, just to give us the sense again that the Gemara is asserting. On a festival, there's no Shiva, and there's no mourning customs. Shene'emar, v'samachta b'chagecha. There's even the challenge. And I'm putting the idiomatic translation in because you have to, I think, read this as the rabbis having real awareness of people's psychological and spiritual and emotional lives. There's even the verse that I might have to achieve, V'samachta b'chagecha. But is it about my simcha? You might think so. Why? Because to be very close to the text, V'samachta is not V'samachtem. You shall be joyous on the Chag, not v'samachtem. You shall, in the plural, be joyous on this Chag. So it might have been like they could have gone here and said, so the mourner who was feeling this acute pain might have to come up and generate some degree of simcha that we see is a requirement on the Chag. That's not where they go, thankfully, because I think that some people, even though they might be among those who could do that, again, a lot of this kol echad, as the Rambam says about some decisions people have to make, as the halachic literature says, kol echad, lefi kol echad. There is a sense of individual experience within Jewish law that does get expressed already early post-Gaonic period. And one might say that the individualism of our age was the time when individualism really came into focus, right? Emancipation, modernity, what have you. I don't buy it. I think we really understand the difference between a yachid, an individual, and a community, and that yichidus, that individualism that we tease out in halachic sources, is so deeply embedded within Talmudic literature, Midrashic literature, even Torah literature, and early liturgy from the land of Israel that, thank God, we have now, because Solomon Schechter goes to Cairo Geniza and grabs the 2,000 manuscripts and puts them in a suitcase and brings them home and publishes the Eretz Yisraeli Sidur that we now hold. That's for another time, whole different shiur. Going to announce it. We're going to study that land of Israel Sidur and compare it to the typical Sidur we have now at some point. But I was just in studying a little bit of that to give you the reflection that there is sometimes that the liturgy over there will be very personalized, and it's an I language versus a we language, let's say, on things that we claim are, it's all the time we, because we're such a people of the we. Well, I say that we're the I, we people. Like Chinese has its yin yang. This is a common kind of philosophical outlook from the start of recognizing the canon of Tanakh and Talmudic literature that we are an I, we people. And this is an example of an I, we. So if it says v'samachta and you thought it meant that the individual had to find a little bit more strength to be b'simcha, the rabbis are really kind of giving a way out of that for the mourner, even though they're lifting the restrictions and not saying you have to really do the serious mourning. I avelut demeikarahu ate ase derabim v'dache ase deyachid. If the Gemara explains, if it is a mourning period that had already begun at the outset of the festival, the positive mitzvah of rejoicing on the festival, which is incumbent on who? The community, comes and overrides the positive mitzvah of the individual. So it's the simcha shel hatzibur, of the public, that overrides it, and it's the royal then we, or the royal you. V'samachta b'chagecha doesn't become the individual, the simcha of the yachid. No, that's about the avelu. That's to an avel. We understand that you're an avelu, but it says v'samachta b'chagecha. You, though, can be part of this community still that has the overriding obligation to find that joy. So you are, in essence, released from the strictness of the avelut, from the laws of mourning, and you can find yourself within this communal experience. Ve'i avelut dehashatahu lo ate ase diyachid v'doche ase derabim. And here's the general principle. And if the mourning period began only now, the deceased died during the festival, the positive mitzvah of the individual does not come and override the positive mitzvah of the community. So that's the flip side. Forget the mourner doesn't practice the halachot on the festival, meaning I could be in a situation where I lost somebody, the festival comes, and now I'm released. But what happens when I'm on the festival, we're all there, and I experience a death? Also, it works just the same way, that if I experience the death of someone during the Chag, my immediate mourning needs does not officially override the positive mitzvah of the community to enjoy the festival. So what's the example? You're during the Moed of Pesach. Somebody passes, somebody's niftar. You could do the burial, but official Shiva won't start till after the Chag.
Where does it say that?
So it's going to say,
Okay.
We're going to see it explicitly, but this is exactly where from it says. Moed Katan in different places.
Okay.
So that is just a little bit more about that conceptually. And now we're going to push on from page 14 here. Make sure there's nothing before our Mishnah I wanted to look at.
Well,
Yeah?
here's my question. So, somebody dies during a festival, and the individual who would normally mourn is not mourning because it's blah blah. So, do they pick it up
Yes.
at the end?
So what I'm saying is, if somebody dies during a festival,
Yeah.
you bury.
Yeah.
And then official Shiva comes at the end
Okay.
of Yontif.
7 days or what?
So again, we're going to see pieces that answer that question, so I don't want to reveal.
All
I
right.
want you to read it from the rabbis, but these are all the right questions. That's what the rabbis themselves are speaking about.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of what
If
we're...
they didn't let you mourn at the end, it's not fair.
Yeah, there you go. That's what I'm saying. So now we're turning...
Who said life is...
Now we're turning
No, if you don't mourn, I agree with you.
19A. If you're turning any pages over there, or you're flipping through, or you're screening. 19A, and it's really easy to find the Mishnah. We're going to read it again in light of all the conversation we've had. Let's see if I can get us there quicker. Here we go. No. Nope. And yes. Okay. So remind you, this is our Mishnah. Matnitin. Hakoveret meito shlosha yamim kodem l'regel. Batla hemenu gezerat shiva. One who buries the deceased relative 3 days before a pilgrimage festival has the decree of the 7-day period of mourning nullified. Meaning, again, we said just before, we'll say it again, all those prohibitions that we take seriously that are listed, that we looked at, we're going to look at again. We're going to see a modern book that also has a list of prohibitions to see what in the Gemara versus what's listed over here. But those are what's really lifted. Is the whole quote-unquote Shiva canceled? Again, that was part of our question as we read the Mishnah. Let's just leave it as the question. What does that mean, canceled? Shmona batlu heimenu gezerat shloshim. Now, it says, if one buries the deceased relative 8 days before a pilgrimage festival, then the decree of 30 is nullified for him. Now, a decree of certain laws that would be prohibitions and restrictive. What does it mean, these days of counting? Because the sages set a principle, we want to say Shabbat Olav Eino Mafseket. Shabbos itself actually counts as a day of mourning, but it's not a day that you do any public ritual, but it's still a day of Shiva. So we didn't say Shabbos annuls the decree of laws that are associated with mourning, just to be clear. Regalim, though, festivals, which we just read back on 14, Mafsikin ve'enan olin, though they interrupt the mourning, and they don't get counted within. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Mi shecharav beit hamikdash atzeret Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer just says, by the by, I think that Shavuos is a little bit like Shabbat in the sense that it's not like Sukkot and it's not like Pesach that have the Moed. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the ancient world, they did have some type of extension of Shavuot. We no longer have it. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, and we didn't read this last week, so we're just filling out the Mishnah now just to show you that they're talking about all these different kinds of days. Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim kirgalim. Gamliel holds that what? Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like regalim, which means what? That they annul those prohibitions. V'chachamim omrim lo kedivrei zeh v'lo kedivrei zeh. It's not like Rabban Gamliel, and it's not like Rabbi Eliezer. Eila atzeret kiregalim. Shavuos is like a regal. So back to the Shavuot conversation that Rabbi Eliezer purported. No, it does behave like a regal, meaning it does annul the prohibitions of Shiva. Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim k'Shabbat. But Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim, those are days that I don't publicly do any kind of mourning. But it's like Shabbos, where they count to the days of Shiva. Okay. Now, the next piece, we're just going to read this beginning little piece of the Gemara. Amar Rav, Gezerat Batlu, Yamim Lo Batlu. Very interesting because he's into this kind of way that we might psycho-spiritually understand the whole period of time. Rav says the gezerah of the decree of prohibitions and certain laws that make for this period of mourning that substantiate what we mean by the way that one ritualizes Shiva, that's what's batel. That's what's nullified. Yamim lo batlu. But the days themselves, not nullified. Now that's a very interesting something to say. Because what do I really mean then? Now that we're here in the Beit Midrash and learning this consciously, and we're the ambassadors for the rabbis, right? We're the ones to go tell our communities. What does that mean? The cancellation of certain prohibitions seems pretty easy. You can put on new clothes. You can shave. For Yontiv's coming. You can have people to the house. Celebrate. You could greet them. Wish them the right greeting for the Chag. Go to shul. Sing Hallel, which you can't do. during Shiva. So there's ritual, lots of ritual things. During the Moed, go hear music. All that's batel. But the idea of the periods of time, listen to this, both 7 and 30, not canceled.
Okay, so are Rav Huna and Rav Sheshet contradicting each other? I mean, it looks like they're contradicting each other.
Right, they are, but I'm saying, what do we even mean by Rav yet?
Well, if they're contradicting each other, then how do we know what to do?
No, we're not looking at the Gemara all the time as what do we do?
Okay.
We're looking at the Gemara as the record of the conversation.
Okay.
And we have to understand what they're arguing.
Right.
So let's first talk about what it means to be batel, really what it means to be still the yamim lo batlu.
Okay.
What does it mean to have days, do you think, that are not batel? How would you personally define that? I'm asking the question, Marian, Ari, Lee, what does it mean to say that the gezerah means it's batel?
And batel is
the prohibitions are nullified.
Okay.
The restrictive laws of Shiva, but the yamim are not nullified. What do you think that's doing?
Confusing me.
Okay, so it could be a little confusing for mourners. They hear the laws of the rabbis. Let's just go with that for a minute. It's like, wait a minute. Rav is saying this, and since Rana brought it up, listen to this. Amar Rabbi Huna, gezerat batlu, yamim lo batlu. Right? So, again, Rav said gezerat batlu, yamim lo batlu. Huna says gezerat batlu, yamim lo batlu. So is that the same or different? Look closely. Rav and Rav Huna. Gezerat batlu, right? Gezerat batlu.
No, okay.
So it looks like what? They're saying the same thing.
Yeah, but not Rav Huna and Rav Sheshet.
Right. So then Rav Sheshet comes into the conversation after the two of them said, Amar afilu yamim nami batlu. Even the days of mourning were also nullified. But again, I don't know what it means by days are nullified or not nullified yet, because we haven't really established that, right? No one's defined that. So I just want to point that out, that sometimes a sugya, sometimes a Talmudic passage, doesn't really hold exactly a meaning. So what do we do when that happens? We generally have to go and we have to first see what Rashi say. And we're going to see if Rashi says anything. So we're on 19. And the Gemara began. What does it say about gezerah? Shloshim batlu aval yamim lo batlu. Shloshim yom lo batlu de'adayin tluyin va'omdim. He simply says, 30-day period really stands. Just to be clear, we're talking about the 30-day period as well. Tell us anything?
I don't think so.
Not a whole lot other than the number of days which we know about. I look over to the left side of the page, and I see the Tosafot. I want to know who else is on my page and what they say. And they don't really add anything to the conversation. I go and I use what we've got with the small n over here, right? Rabbi Steinsaltz is going to give us something, please God. The days were not nullified. Some explain that when he starts with that he doesn't have an exact source. He's, from all his years of learning, giving us something good, hopefully, a gem that he's found. Some explain that according to Rav, the harsh decrees of mourning are nullified. However, the days of mourning themselves are not nullified. Well, we know that already. Therefore, after the festival, oh, that's what it means. The period of possibility of the mourning rituals and restrictions are still open. Therefore, after the festival, one is required to make up the days on which he did not mourn by refraining from cutting his hair during that time. Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Hayatom. Now, what that means to me, I didn't check in Rabbeinu Shlomo ben Hayatom except for over here by the Steinsaltz. I would say that he, with love for folks who find a way to fulfill a phrase in the Gemara that you really don't know exactly what it means, that this Rav said, no, that's really the thing that outwardly says to the group of guys that this guy davens with, the community in which he takes a part, she takes a part, that if her hair is not done, his beard is growing, then that's an outward sign of a velut for 30 days. And it lets me know what's going on, even beyond, like, I'm not there all the time to daven and hear Kaddish and say amen. So he chose something to really say it's still in effect and there's got to be some restriction, as in don't shave, don't get a haircut. But that's not exactly what it said explicitly in the Gemara itself. So there is some halachic reality that's going on there to define it, or the fact that we still want to give people not only the sense of, yeah, we just want to lay a restriction on you. That's not really the point of all this. The point is that we want people to actually see you and offer you words of comfort.
They want to see you mourning.
We want to be seen in our avelut,
Okay.
or we want to
Okay.
see you. Works both ways. I want to know, God forbid, you experience a loss. If you had experienced a loss and you came and you were here for a kiddush and it was 3 weeks later and I didn't know, but I know that I'm in community with you, right?
So if I had a beard, you would know.
So right. So then the question becomes, what do we say if it's about letting your beard grow and generally men keep their hair in such a way that I can kind of realize, that you're letting it grow a little longer generally for these folks, especially because of issues in the Talmudic era of lice and the reason why to really keep your hair short. Then I can really know. For women, maybe there's a different something. Like it had to be spoken about a little bit more publicly if we're talking about modern times. So maybe it's, I'm not coming to the musical activities that we do at the synagogue for someone. Maybe I'm taking myself out of this kind of thing. So I'm seeing within the note, the way the Gemara speaks and the way that the note seems to reflect a certain halachic choice of this source that Rabbi Steinsaltz is bringing forward, that there's real halachic flexibility, and as they say, tzarich iyun. It needs further investigation. And I have yet, I have different marks on my pages about what I need to now learn out. So what's the line of inquiry we need to make in order to make good on learning this daf into its fullness, this sugya? We need to say, what does it really mean that Yamim lo batlu, that the days are not nullified? Now, the tradition has answered in another way too, that a festival comes, like I said, beginning of Pesach or during the Moed, during Chol Moed. Same with Sukkot. What do? We institute a time of official Shiva. And so the answer to a family who's lost somebody during that time is, yes, you still have Shiva, and we're going to start it after Yontif. Rana's question on that is the same question as the sages asked in a different piece of the Gemara we're going to get to. Are you talking about full 7 days? Okay, so we're going to get there. And now we're going to go to 19b. Okay. Amar Rav Huna, Bereze Rav Yehoshua. Rav Huna, who is the son of Rav Yehoshua, says the following. Hakol modin, keshechal shlishi shelo, lihiot erev haragel, she'asur berechitza ada erev. Okay, now we're going to confirm, that you really have to have 3 days of mourning before the regel. Whose opinion is that? Our Mishnah. How do we know that it's really agreeing with the opinion of the Mishnah that you have to have 3 days? Because most people agree that during the day pre-regel, pre-chag, what am I allowed to do? Wash my clothing, put on new clothes, really get ready for the regel. But over here, it's actually delaying the washing until the nighttime. Why? Because I have to fulfill the full 3 days of mourning. Now, again, have to, obligated to. You might have individuals who fall into this category. They do the burial on a Friday morning, takes a long time to get home. They got to get things set for Chag. They didn't have any time to actually sit. So they themselves, kol echad, lafi kol echad, they themselves understand that they never really entered the period of Shiva at all. You talk it out with your rabbi. You say and you agree, and there's a decision made. You really never had it, even 1 hour, which becomes important soon because we got to that Breita last week, and we're going to get back to it. That even if you sat 1 hour, stands against the claim that if you sat 3 days, that it's nullified. But if I said I didn't even sit an hour, you could have that scenario and have to do Shiva later. Either which way, if you are doing Shiva and you do have the restrictions, and you're the type of person who says 3 days of those restrictions is really enough, and we talked about that being kind of like in the consciousness of Jews in modernity, that a lot of people are saying 3 days is enough, and herefrom, you get some of that thinking going on potentially by the rabbis and by individuals who are experiencing it, that the regel comes to really displace it and that there's more Jewish obligation vis-a-vis the regel, I think has something to do with it as much as you kind of had to get ready for the holiday and drop all of the Shiva kind of stuff. But again, all in there in the experience of Jewish souls. But here we're talking about really delaying what sounds like something you should be permitted, bathing, before the holiday, until the evening. And the legal status of the part of the day is like that of an entire day, doesn't apply. Meaning, we've seen in the discussions of halakha concerning either the last day of Shiva or the burial itself moving into day 1 of Shiva, that one part of the day that I spend in mourning or that I spend in prayer at the end of Shiva is like the whole day. Mm-hmm. So I can get up early, or I can say, no, I was only at my house for mincha and the evening meal, and Mariv for the first day of Shiva, but that's still one full day because I got back to my house at 3 p.m. from the cemetery. Meanwhile, I see that there's a delay to wash, and that fulfills, it sounds like it's fulfilling the 3 days. Halakha, the 3rd day occurs on the eve of the festival. If a festival interrupts one's 7-day mourning period, he may launder his clothes on the day preceding the festival, though he may not wear laundered clothes until the festival begins at night. However, he's prohibited from bathing until nightfall, as in what we just read. Some permit him to bathe after the afternoon prayer immediately before it becomes dark. So there he's bringing us halakha l'maaseh, Rabbi Steinsaltz, to tell us that some have looked at it a little differently throughout halachic history. And if we were doing a full course, again, in one little section of the Gemara, we could open this up widely to see who are the Rishonim who really already asked the question. right? Is it Tosafot who asked that question? Is it the Rambam who asked that question? Is it the Meiri who asked that question? All kinds of helpful halachic tools, history, to give us a sense of what happened, the French authorities versus German authorities, all that kind of stuff we would put into focus. Rabbi Steinsaltz summarizes for us. Some have said that, in fact, he could wash the clothes, but he waits. And some, he's prohibited from bathing until nightfall. Some permit him to bathe after the afternoon tefillah, that's mincha, immediately before it becomes dark. So it's obviously a late mincha. The Ramah writes, and the Ramah, remember, is Rabbi Moshe Isserles, 16th century, lives in Krakow, was writing glosses on the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 16th century from the Polish Ashkenazic experience, writes that this is prohibited because the custom not to bathe during the 30-day period applies. So welcome, folks, to 30 days of no bathing during the morning period.
So
that was in a time.
So this trumps the other thing.
As the festival does not cancel the 30-day period of mourning. The same is true with regard to laundering in places where it's customary for a mourner to refrain from laundering his clothes for 30 days. However, it's the common practice to be lenient. Right? Don't you love those grand statements? Well, he gives you all the places that we could, take those texts, which is lovely and is really, really great about Rabbi Steinsaltz in this version of the Talmud. You want to see all that inside? Go ahead. The Magen Avraham, who's the commentary that's a little bit after the Ramah, Shach, Taz on Shulchan Aruch, Yoredea, and Orach Chaim. Okay, so that's going to be what's happening over there. One more paragraph of this part. This is going to be a repetition, is just to show you a little bit about how repetitions, confirm things in the Gemara. Rav Nechemya beredei Rav Yoshua. Rabbi Nechemya, son of Rabbi Yoshua, says, Ashka chatin hu l'Rav Papi u'l'Rav Papa the yotaviv ka'amri halacha k'Rav Huna beredei Rav Yoshua. The halacha is like Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yoshua. Ika da Amri Amar Rav Nechemya beredei Rav Yosef. There are those who say that it was really Nechemya who was the son of Rav Yosef and not the son of Rav Yoshua. We're not talking about his brother. Ashka chatin hu l'Rav Papi u'l'Rav Papa l'Rav Huna beredei Rav Yoshua. And there we have the source that we were waiting for. That's Rav Huna beredei Rav Yoshua. The Yotvi v'Ka'amri. They were sitting and they were schmoozing and they were saying and they were learning. Hakol Modim. Everybody really concedes. She'im chal shlishi shelo liyot erev haregel, that if or when the third day of mourning occurs on the eve of a festival, what happens? Shasor b'rechitza ad ha'erev. It's prohibited. He's prohibited from bathing and his body until the evening. Okay, so there we have confirmation. Why do you have confirmation stories? A, could be very technical reason. The rabbis have a different story from a group of other sages where there's Aramaic involved, Ika, the Amri, that it's Amoraic level that adds on to the Tanaitic level. You want to see what the chain of tradition is really all about any given time that you're studying Talmud. Just like we mentioned with the halachic outcomes, we want to see the chain of tradition within the halachic sources. And then we want to be true to those sources as we think about whether or not there's any room to make different decisions about what the traditions are. So this is a confirmation of the fact that we really try to extend this period of time of the 3 days. Now, it does sound here, just to now go back to our Mishnah, it does sound here that folks really agreed that 3 days before Regel is the only time that we're talking about and the solid amount of time needed to have mourning practices, customs, and restrictions. And if I'm looking to extend it on day 3 to make sure it's 3 days so I can live out the reality of the Mishnah, I got to make sure that I put some guardrails up. And here's one of the guardrails. So they want to teach that, of course, so that you fulfill what they wrote in this Mishnah that we learned. And they also want to make sure that when they teach these things, they're saying them out loud and publicly, so that there's an acceptance that there could be this reality in the house that the Avel himself, the mourner, does not have to really go take a bath. Regal's coming. Yontiv's coming. If you've ever been in a house that gets ready for Yontiv, you might know that there are some people who get really nervous. Everybody should be bathed and dressed pretty early. I'm not saying anybody in my house does that. I've been in certain houses where if there are 9 children, trust me, they are making sure that there's that fine line between mayhem and order. You want to see it? It's a house full of children before a Yontif. Okay. Let's now press on a little bit. Still about 3 days. I'm now going to 20a. Let me just stop for a second before I go further. Anybody up to now want to say a reflection or have a question before I push on? Because we're going to move to the end of a holiday that has a Chol Moed.
Yeah, I have a question.
Hello, who's that?
Lauren,
Lauren who?
Gaten.
Hi, Lauren. How did you find us?
Through email, and I believe I went to your synagogue one day and I just introduced myself and they added me to the email list.
That's so
I
nice.
saw you guys at a booth at a street fair.
Oh, very nice. Well, I'm glad you came. Welcome. Okay.
I think that, like this kind of reminds me of the Jonah and the whale, when he regurgitates Jonah and he comes back and he thought that he died or he has no repentance or he'll never have a fulfilled ending. And then in the end, Jonah survives and he's given a second chance from God. Same type of thing I see here is like, you don't know what to do in a situation. Do I pray now? Do I bury the dead? What do I do in a situation like this? Well,
Yeah, very, very literary. I've not thought about the Jonah connection with the laws of mourning like that, but I do see that, he himself took it upon himself to restrict himself from doing God's work,
yeah,
refused to do it because he felt like this world wasn't for him. And then God spits him out into not a festival, but into dry land and into a new conversation with him and gives him another chance for it. So I do see some parallels to ups and downs and rhythms in life. It doesn't exactly track for me, but I would love for you to say a little bit more if you want to about how you are comparing the law of the first 3 days of being in mourning after a death to Jonah's time in the great big fish.
because you're mourning, you're trying to bring connection. Like my parents are currently going to a shiva right now, talking about this for a family member whose grandfather died.
Mm-hmm.
And survived World War II. You're in mourning, you're thinking about all the good things that they did, but then, there's this disconnect between you and the person because the person has to deal with much greater things. They
Yeah.
have to deal with putting together the shiva, making
Mm.
sure their family member is, is respected and the services go well and coordinate that with the rabbi and then obviously working on yourself, working on your own repentance, your own relationship with God now that, a important family member of yours, lived such a fruitful life, but then unfortunately died.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for
You're welcome.
bringing up those experiences and that thoughtful literary kind of intertext.
Well,
Okay, so so here I go into another little piece that's on page 20, and this is going to be before the Breita that we got to the last time. Just to, again, set us into motion with these different 3-day periods and what they do with the idea that there are sometimes 3 days worth of Shiva to discuss. And how does that come up in other ways? And now watch how this comes up in a different way. Kvaro shlosha yamim b'sof haregel. Oh, so now let's talk about a period of time where it's 3 days before the end of a festival. Monei Shiva achar regel. The general law says that you're going to count 7 days of mourning after the festival because the mourning never began. So the official period of Avelut didn't begin because the death happened during the regel. And from the end of the holiday begins the period 7:30 Hala and more. Says the Gemara, Arba Yamim Harishonim, the first 4 days, Rabim Mitaskin Bo, the public occupies itself with those days to console him, meaning there's 4 days in my focus now that really become acute for this person because I want to attend to the mourner's needs. Shlosha Yamim Achronim, but the 3 days that are at the end of the 7, another period of 3 days here, which we hadn't talked about before. Now I'm talking about a period of 4 and then 3 at the end of Shiva that are the Shiva after a holiday. Ein Rabbi mitaskin bo. I don't have the communal obligation to actually occupy myself with the Shiva needs of the guy like I would have had for the 7 days of Shiva previously. Shekvar nitasku b'regel. Regel olelo, and the festival counts for him toward the 30-day mourning period. So this is a really interesting piece. Those 3 days of the regel that I had to bury because we bury within 24 hours. We're not talking about a time where we delay for everybody to come and it's 3 days in the morgue or 2 days in the morgue. Even we did it. And during the Moed we bury, but we don't start official Shiva. But the public Shiva, what is the number of days that seem like the number of days then that someone could be announcing Shiva for visitations? How many? 4. 4 days the community is obligated, meaning those are the days to be publicly sitting Shiva in your house. But it doesn't mean that 7 is gone. It means that days 5, 6, and 7 is not necessarily a day to invite people to the house for Shiva, because already the 3 days of regel were days that count for you. But wait a minute, I thought we weren't counting 3 days of regel. I thought you had to count 7 after the holiday. Stay with me here?
Yeah.
Oh, but the days of the regel, since it was 3 days at the end of it, they count towards the 30. So when I have the burial from day X of the Chag, I count 30 days, and that's my shloshim. But for Shiva, now it's not the first of the 30 days. This is when I've moved Shiva to day 4 of shloshim. This is Jewish math in a very, very different way than we've thought about it before. So I'm going to get the clarity again. Say it again with me. A person dies 3 days before the end of a holiday.
Right.
You're about to make Havdalah at the end of Pesach or the end of Sukkot, which is the end of Simchas Torah.
So they bury.
They bury. For 3 days, you're in that holiday space. There's no public Shiva. But since you didn't start Shiva, you do a public Shiva. But how many days do you do a public Shiva? 4. Because the Gemara says so.
All right, so
4.
okay. So what I'm confused about is, so what we're saying is these 3 days before the end of the festival don't count for the Shiva.
Correct.
Okay.
But they do count for what?
Shloshim.
Shloshim. And at that 30-day period you're either toggling the switch on or off for the very restrictive parts of the morning period.
Right.
And 7 doesn't necessarily mean all the time that you sit for 7. It means you define a period of time within the 30 as being either acutely in mourning, or in this case, partly acute in mourning that the community comes to really console you. How many days is that after the holiday?
3.
4.
4.
Look here. This is where it says 4.
Those days at the end of the holiday, they're not Yom Tovs. It's a whole Moed. So
Yeah, well, it could be Pesach where it's Chol Moed, or it could be Sukkot where it's 2 Yontifs.
because the last 2 days are Yom Tov, not the.
Oh, so you're reading very close. So you're reading very close.
That if it's 3 days of a holiday, the person dies on. It has to be then a Chol Moed. There has to be something to it.
So you're saying that 3 days before the end of the festival is the Chol Moed days only.
It's a whole
You're reading
has
it?
to be a Chol Moed day if it's 3 days. At the end of the holidays, 6.
But I'm saying
It's a Shabbat.
I'm saying like this. It could be that Tuesday is the last day of Chol Moed, Hoshana Rabbah of Sukkot.
Okay.
Wednesday is already Shmini Atzeret. Thursday is already Simchas Torah. But your argument, and by the way, this is exactly what the Rishonim sometimes debate about. How do I read this? And so you're reading this. No, you're getting from the Lashon that we're not talking about a time that's the end of Sukkot, that goes from the last day of Hoshana Rabbah, 7th day Chol Moed, Sukkot, to Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah. It's what we're really talking about in this small section of the Gemara is either it was the last 3 days of Chol Moed Sukkot or Chol Moed Pesach, and here I had to wait another 2 days of Yontiv at the end of Sukkot. But either which way, I only make 4 days of public communal Shiva. And by the way, if it's extra 2 days of Yontiv in there, I simply count them in the count of Shloshim, because I've got a working functional notion of Shloshim.
Seems to me that we're not, well, my takeaway is that the period of Shloshim is less confusing than the period of Shiva.
Okay, that's a good takeaway. That's one potential.
Straightforward. It's when the days vary.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Yeah.
So I have another question, and maybe because I didn't come last.
Mhm.
But I don't understand something here. They don't talk about what if the person dies 2 days before the holiday? What if you bury the person on the day?
We're just about to get there.
The sun's gonna go down and you can't even sit Shiva.
Right.
Like my former mother-in-law, they just sat Shiva for an hour and they had
Correct.
to get up and then they never sat Shiva.
And I only mentioned it in passing and that we were going to return to it, which we're going to do now. So the next piece is all about that. Because we have a tradition within the Gemara, even though the Mishnah was only about 3 days before, here's what we have. A Braita, Tanu Rabbanan. Kiem kfi aramita shlosha yamim kodim haregel. We're going to say again that it doesn't say anything about Shiva. It does say that your kiem kfi aramita. You fulfilled the obligation of turning the bed over. What's the turning the bed over?
Yeah.
This is one of the customs. There was either one of two things happening in a Shiva house in the ancient world. You were either, instead of using your regular table, you used the bed as a table for food, which is the one that people forget. The one that people mostly know is that you turned the bed over and you sat on it to be the low stool.
Right, we sit on a bed. We sit on the floor.
So the latter one is still used today. The fact that we eat at the regular table by all standards in most of the Jewish world did not carry over from the ancient use of the back of the bed for the Sudas. Just so we have it clear. Anyway, to not get into that very question that we could make the line of inquiry, what do we really mean by overturning the bed, and where does it come from, and how do you do it, and all this kind of stuff? What's the operative piece that we want to really look at here? That's Shlosha Yamim, Kodem HaRegel. Very clear, it relates to the 3 days before the regel that we had in our Mishnah. Eino tzarich lichpota achar haregel, divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So what does Rabbi Eliezer hold? The Tana, Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says to you, if you did 3 days before the regel and you did some of morning practices and you had the restrictions and you thought to do all the Shiva, ad, the turning over of the bed. You even turned over your bed. You did this for real, as we require. You're no longer required to overturn it after the festival. Now, are we only talking about turning over the bed and the rest of the restrictions come back? Some of the Rishonim want to know. But really, we take the Braita to mean that the Shiva is nullified. And the Chachamim Omrim, that what do we say about this issue, though, that when it comes to the sages, this is exactly what you just asked about, Mindy. Afilu yom echad, afilu sha'a echad. Even if he overturned his bed only for 1 day or even for 1 hour, he's not required to overturn it after the festival. Now, let me just share what we did last week, and that is we went to see where that's from. This is an Eretz Yisraeli tradition. It's an ancient Israelite kind of imagination that got this into the Tosefta as well, that parallel text to the Mishnah. And it brings us to a different understanding of the periods of time that a person has to actually achieve this or experience this. The reason why I brought up the whole framework of learning this is not only just to learn it for its own sake, but to explore what this really means, because some of the emotion that was just in your comment, and I'll let you say it again, but just to be clear about it, some people see this as canceled and nullified, and then they lose the entire opportunity to do this. And how could that be, since we feel as though, and we want to say, our tradition is here to actually guide us through these waters of mourning and loss, right?
Right.
So is that what you want to say? You want to say more?
Felt like it was an opportunity to celebrate for like the little person she was, and no opportunity to do that. And I think it was damaging to the family in so many respects. So I don't understand, like, I have such great respect for the rabbis, and I know that they know more than I do, but I still don't understand.
Yeah. I'm just going to say, Ron, I'll get to you in a second. I'm just going to say that one of the reasons why we're looking back to the Bavli for wisdom, especially in our time, as we understand people and their hearts and their minds, and we take into account Jewish experience in our own way. Pokaze, go out, learn, says the Gemara. And that local decisors with communities are trusted to really evaluate what the normative halacha is and what the potentials within halachic living are as we're conscious about these things. So far, we've seen at least one example where someone experienced the holiday and then went right back to a public shiva. What most people hear and think is that it's canceled, nullified, or there's not a chance. But what most people don't understand from the pastoral perspective is that they need to shepherd people through these time periods to really plan it out according to the needs of celebrating people's lives and figuring out how the community responds. And that when people hear so-and-so died right before the Yontiv and there was a burial Friday, and now Shabbos is the first day of Yontiv, and then there's going to be all this, and there's not going to be a Shiva, right? No, wrong. We actually have in this very, I would say, almost transactional world of modern day halacha, where it's become play by the rules, let them guide you exactly how it should be, and then don't think further than the little statement, because, to really complete the transaction I have with, supposedly God, but with the law, that I'm fulfilling this, that if it says that a regel comes and nullifies, it says, oh, Shiva's canceled. So the community kind of says in their mind, given the let's say, dynamic way of really talking about this within community, communicating about the lessons that the Gemara has for us that we've seen. If you simply think that it gets canceled, then the family does lose the opportunity entirely to share about their loved one in the midst of communal davening post the days of holiday. Like, everybody wait for it. So-and-so's just had a loss. But part of the reason why it took off in the way that it did, and that families kind of accepted that, is because I believe more and more relationships got transactional. There's less and less real connection with people, not only to you, but especially to parents who don't live near us. There's less and less desire for people to come around and sit and study Mishnah in honor of people who they don't know. There's less and less connectivity generally, and that means for more cancellation of the humanity within our tradition to start. And so it's our challenge and it's our invitation, because we already have certain ways modeled to get right back to it. There's a certain level here too of recognizing that different people will experience it differently. And maybe those who experienced it for an hour, who then need to go into a full week of Yontiv, like, okay, enough. Like, that's enough community for me. I don't know that I really need the next. And we're going to hear a little bit of more of a heter than people generally think there is, more permissiveness to actually have people over for comfort. But it doesn't have to be called the prohibitions and requirements of Shiva proper, even though Shiva can still be used. Why can Shiva still be used? Why could I still say that there's Shiva, according to what we've read thus far?
Are you missing something?
No,
I'm missing a big thing.
Listen again.
Because it's about community and not about, it's.
Listen again.
In the week?
No, hold on. I'm going to read you again. We could say that the decree of the decree of the Shiva itself, Batlu Gezerat Shiva, that the Gezerah is Batel. What was the Gezerah again? The decree of all those laws and prohibitions, but what was not canceled or nullified?
Shiva.
Shiva,
That's why
the 7-day period.
right. So I'm told, are we ready for my question?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's confusing me with this is that they are not saying that there is no period of Shiva, even if one overturns his bed for one, blah, blah, blah. He is not required to, blah, blah, blah. But there is nothing that says he is not required to observe 7 days of mourning. In this. As far
Exactly.
as-
The idea is,
Rabbi, say it again.
the idea is,
Yeah, because I like their justice.
Akol modin shechal shlishi shelo liyod erev haregel she'asor b'rechitza, right? We said you can't wash because you got to really have the 3-day period, right? So we know the 3-day period is there. What was the 3-day period really all about? 2 levels. One, it was 3 of 7. That is a period in which you could have specific mourning customs, rules, legislation apply or not. Even if I say that a certain amount of those laws, rules, prohibitions don't apply, right? It doesn't mean that my 7-day, 30-day periods are a buttle. It means somewhere in there, you have to live with the gray matter of Jewish tradition and say, no, that person's still in Shiva. You have to be willing to say and make meaning of this for somebody who's had a loss or for yourself. You know what? I know that they're not doing shacharit at their house, but they're in Shiva. I know that they're not saying Mincha Mariv tonight at so-and-so's house, but they're still in Shloshim.
But that's what's confusing. Shloshim is.
It can't be. It's only confusing because you've not been trained to really approach the idea that there's a period of mourning that doesn't necessarily mean do this, do that, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that.
But I understand that. But what I'm saying is that what's going on with Shloshim is clear to me. That's clear. What's not clear to me is Shiva.
Well, it's not so clear because even Shloshim sometimes they're saying could have the nullification of the gezeras of Shloshim. You might be able to only let your hair grow out. You could do everything else during Shloshim. In general, the laws of mourning require me to have lots of different prohibitions and observe them. But we read by Rabbi Steinsaltz that there's one guy who says, no, when this guy was finished for that period of time where holidays and Shiva days were all mixed up, that ultimately all he had to do was let the hair grow. So it is getting comfortable when you return to the Bavli sometimes with a little bit of, it's not giving you the cookbook. Jews love cookbooks. Jews love codification.
Yes.
They love rules.
I would be happy with.
But that's what Gemara is all about sometimes. It's to bring us back to the conversation of how do I really see these texts and life meeting up. So in the sense, though, that some people wanted less potentially, and I do say it's from desires, and God wanted less for them of needing the requirements of a full 7 days of festival, then a full 7 days of actually turning the bed over and having the public descend on their homes. Think about the mercy that can be for some people. For other people, you miss the entire notion of the community coming and the comfort of the community being there. And, I know that I would want that. Amy would definitely say, oh, this is really wise, this law, to say I only needed to come to shul the 7 days and I don't need now 7 days of Shiva in my house. We're like that. We have two different approaches right in our own house. So that's a potential answer to your question. How could it be? How we could understand the difference between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. That's what we try to do. We try to understand what the motivations were behind them. Amar Reb Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon, hen divrei Beit Shammai, hen divrei Beit Hillel. And by the way, the Rabbi Eliezer's and the Chachamim's conversation goes back a generation or two. This is a real question. How long does someone really need to do the active Shiva routine? How long does there need to be before these big, long holiday stretches come? Do they need to go back to them? Are the gezeras nullified? Yet the periods we know go on. And is there some way in public that they still need to show that they're in Avelu? So, Beit Shammai omrim shlosha yamim. Beit Shammai was the one to say it was 3 days. Uveit Hillel omrim afilu yom echad. 3 days. And Hillel was the one who said even 1 day.
Typical.
The funny thing is about Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. If you say that it's typical, meaning Shammai's more strict and Hillel's more lenient, think about this. Shlosha Yamim, that's pretty strict for some people, 3 days of mourning. Whereas for other people, it's not enough. Hillel says even 1 day, some people really don't want to mourn publicly. And this is true. 30 years in the rabbinate, part of real communities that did this all together all the time, you meet all kinds of people. And you meet all kinds of people who had all kinds of relationships. And so some of these seem to come at the right time, and one person could make meaning like, you know what? This was perfect gift. because I don't want to have to talk about them. Now it's unfortunate, but it's a reality. What the sources have said thus far is that, but when we do see this and we do feel like there's not enough time in Shiva, there is an expectation that we could put on both the public and grant the mourner that there could, so far we've seen a very interesting number that's not really used enough in halachic discussions around Shiva, the 4-day period. Because whatever the 3 days were, whether they were just Chol Moed or they were Yontos, we saw that. Okay? So really good. We've fleshed a bunch of that out. Let's go back again to where we were. All right, so now we see that it's a Hillel Shammai discussion. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, V'amri la Amar Rabbi Yochanan, la Rabbi Chia bar Abba, la Rav Huna. Afilu yom echad, even if it was 1 day, no, he's going to add to it. Afilu sha'a echad. Doesn't have to just be 1 day, it could be an hour. And there's your hour. Rava Amar, halacha katana didan de Amar shlosha. And Rava says the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of the Tana of our Mishnah, who said 3 days. Is that the halacha?
No.
No. So just so you know, even when the Gemara tells you that the halacha is like so-and-so, never trust it.
Mm-hmm.
You always got to go and you always got to say, what happened? What happened? So Rabbi Steinsaltz, of course, has this on the side this time. Halacha. One who buries his dead before a festival. When one buries a close relative before a festival and begins observing mourning practices, even in private and even for a short period of time, the remainder of his 7 days of mourning are nullified by the festival. Again, he said that very generally, and anybody reading just the English would not get the complexity and the psychodynamism of what we are discussing right now. The psycho-spiritual dynamism. Yeah, that's a good term. In such a case, the days of the festival also count toward the 30-day period of mourning. However, if one did not observe any mourning practices beforehand, whether intentionally or accidentally, and here's where the family could have said, I'm going to not observe, and I'm going to announce Shiva will be observed after the festival. You immediately say it. The festival does not nullify the mourning. Therefore, one must observe the mourning customs in private during the festival. Oh, that's interesting.
Never heard that one before.
And comforters come to visit and console him in his home. Then he observes the 7-day period of mourning after the festival. During those days, his work is performed by others, since he refrained from working during the festival and was consoled. However, the festival counts toward the 30-day mourning period because he observed the customs of this 30-day period during the intermediate days of the festival. So learning halacha more deeply could have led to someone who's really come from that cemetery on a Friday, got everything ready, intentionally or accidentally, or incidentally, didn't observe. And then they have a private, and you just heard what he said in his summary, which is true if we were going to go again, look at Shulchan Aruch and learn these things through, that people could come. Yeah. And they come, but not as Shiva visits. It's a technicality. It's a halachic consciousness that's changing. And sometimes what we say as we learn halachic sugiyas throughout the Gemara process, that our halacha consciousness, our Jewish legal consciousness, is helping us frame our living experience. But you see that the more you learn, the more humanizing it gets. And the more possible the comfort, in this case, comes to the mourner. And there are some conscious decisions to make, and there are some what will be happenstance realities to which Jewish law will respond. Last little note to finish up the sugya and our engagement with this part of Moed Katan. Ravina happened to come to the city of Sura on the banks of the Euphrates River. And Rav Chaviva says to Ravina, what is the halacha with regard to this issue? And he says to him, even 1 day even 1 hour. And that's where from we take the 1 day, 1 hour piece. But does it just mean totally canceled? The answer is no. So in that sense, may all those who had any loved ones come into focus during the learning of Moed Katan see them in their mind's eyes or their hearts, hold them in their hearts for inspiration. May any unfulfilled shivas feel a little bit more fulfilled because we've now learned through this issue. May our hearts incline towards those in Shiva with bodies back or just out of Shiva and in their shloshim in Israel. May the hostages be released this hour, this minute, all of them. And may our learning bring zechut la kol Am Yisrael and for a better world that can handle very difficult discussions in our time.
My other question for you is, did you visit any of the hostage families?
Of course, of course. Yeah. So they're our heroes in crazy ways. They became our heroes. So great to learn with everybody. Thanks.